So continuing by question 3 and question 4, why and how do countries trade? As I said, this is a form of a possible exam question, giving the historical changes and why changes would have occurred between models, starting at when there wasn't a model existing, when there was a philosophy of mercantilism, and then maybe discussing why Adam Smith came along, why he gave his concept, and then moving on to why Ricardian came along, why he introduced his model based on what the deficiencies are, maybe with Adam Smith's model. So just maybe a historical approach. You're not forced to take that. You can just purely say this is how trade is in the world. Most people are just buying manufactured goods. They're not really buying primary goods. And all these models don't adhere to this because they talk about currently having a speciality in a certain product or something like that. So you just need to be able to pull from every model and know every model really well. Then you are able to discuss the deficiencies in every model based on looking at maybe from historical concept or looking at how do all these models fit how the world is actually trading. Whichever approach you go is fine, or you can say that the Adam Smith model is the best model because it's able to explain the majority of trade that goes across the world. Then you explain why. Explain how this model really fits. Then you explain how all the other models don't fit. But anyways, let's go further and actually start with one of the smaller models on that. So main model to exist. And this we have not done mercantilism yet. It's just a way of thinking, a philosophy at a time on how to trade in that. We'll get to that hopefully in week's 2 videos. But for now, we're just gonna lightly look into Adam Smith's work, which is covered in the introduction lecture. So this is important. I might not even go and touch this again into week 2 because it does cover a bit of week 2's work. So Adam Smith looked at this in terms of there being only labor. Nothing else. No capital, nothing else. So these labors specialize in certain tasks. So you have maybe 100 workers in a country, 50 of them are producing or helping produce apples of a tree, 30 of them are producing boats, and 20 of them are producing wine, something like that. So you're saying you have a set amount of population and each one does certain tasks. But he was more into the idea that, well, we as a country or we as a company or whatever else you see it as. So the thing is, sometimes some people will discuss a country as a firm. They see a country as a firm. So this firm or this country produces apples. So this is what he was trying to say. We as a country are only going to produce, or it's best for us to specialize in the one product only. What is the one product? We don't know, or we're going to find a certain guideline to find this product. But it's that product which we produce in the best and most cheapest possible way. And we're able just to produce the most when you look at it in terms of any other countries. So this was his idea. We have labor only. There's no capital in this industry. We're gonna produce a good and we're gonna specialize in. We're not gonna produce any other goods in the country. We're gonna take all our 100 people in this country and produce that good. So what would you do then? So you say, okay, say in the world there was only those 3 things that we discussed: apples, boats, and wine. Well, let's keep it simpler. There's only apples and boats produced in the entire world. That's the only 2 things we consume. So for us as a country, let's say country A, we find out that we are better at producing apples. So we only produce apples. We're not going to produce boats at all. But as a country, we're not going to eat all the things we produce in terms of apples. Every apple we produce, we're not going to consume in this country. We're only going to eat or consume whatever our country needs. Then we're going to have leftover. This leftover that we have, we're going to use this to trade with country B, which produces boats only. This is a better off position than having produced apples and boats, according to Adam Smith. So he says when you specialize, you're going to gain more from producing this one good and using whatever is left over and go and trade with for the other good that you're missing. And then he obviously was talking in terms of firms, but he said whether it's firms, whether it's individuals, we can look at this in terms of a country. We can say we're a country exporting a good like a company. And in the sense then he was saying whichever good we're producing the most of with the amount of labor we have and in the most efficient way, we would then export whatever excess we have. We're trying then to relate this in terms of cost differences. It's cheaper for us to produce this good when we produce this good the most with the same amount of labor. So country B might also have 100 workers, and we as country have 100 workers also. But our 100 workers can produce 150 apples, while their 100 workers for country B can only produce 80 apples. So we are better for that 100 people we are paying in terms of cost. We get a lot more apples. So it's more cost efficient for us to produce that. While for country B, it's not. Country B, on the other hand, they can take their 100 workers and produce 200 boats, while we can maybe only produce 20 boats. So for them, the cost for producing boats is cheaper because with the same amount of labor, assuming the cost of labor was the same between countries, they would be able to use more boats. So it would be a cheaper amount of wages they would pay per boat. So this is the whole thing of looking at cost differences between two countries. What is cheaper for us to produce based on the labor we have in a country? So this is a reminder of what you should know from your undergrad course. Here's an example that asks you in terms of Adam Smith, or in terms of as we know as absolute advantage. Who has absolute advantage? Who is the best at producing apples or an Xbox between South Africa, which is RSA, and AUS, which is Australia? And this is something you have to look at. We will assume that what's in the brackets is every one worker produces 5 apples in South Africa, or every one worker produces 10 apples in Australia, or every one worker produces 15 Xboxes in South Africa, or every one worker produces 40 Xboxes in Australia. So if you look in terms of apple, one worker can produce either 5 in South Africa or 10 in Australia. So Australia has a better advantage or produces apples in the most cheapest manner. They only need half a labor to produce exactly the same as South Africa. But for the same amount of labor they produce, double. And if you look in terms of Xboxes, one laborer would get you far more in Australia. So it's much more cheaper to produce apples and Xboxes in Australia. So they have absolute advantage in both senses. But now the problem is, if they are cheaper producing apples and Xboxes, does Adam Smith model say we can trade? Because Australia can produce both things cheaper than what South Africa can produce. How the hell is trade going to happen now in the sense? So this is the idea where recording came along. He says it was possible to trade even if a country like Australia could produce apples and Xboxes more cheaper. So this is where the idea came of relative advantage. And this is was to look at, okay, what is the trade-off between apples and Xboxes for one particular South Africa? Or what is the trade-off for producing apples and Xboxes for Australia? And this we're going to cover in week 2 lectures. But for now, just remember the idea of absolute advantage, which you should remember from your undergraduate. You should remember what absolute advantage is.